welcome to our Annenberg Research Seminar. Today's speaker is a distant relative. Dan Berger recently received his PhD from the other Annenberg School, the old original, and the University of Pennsylvania, where he is currently one of the two Gerbner postdoctoral fellows, which is a rather nice program that was created for doctoral graduates of both Annenberg schools in honor of George Gerbner, who was the longtime dean of the Annenberg School, University of Pennsylvania. And I'm looking around and not seeing any obvious interested parties in this, but in case there are any, or you know any, the announcement has just gone out for the applications for the next round of the Gerbner. So if anyone is, as I said, I'm looking around and not seeing any obvious candidates. This is for doctoral graduates of either of the two schools. In fact, the other current Gerbner postdoc, Amelia Arsenault, is a doctoral graduate of this program. In any case, Dan, I assume, will be speaking on something related to his dissertation. It seems to say guest. And he will speak on race, prison, protest, and the paradox of visibility.
Thank you very much, Larry, for the introduction. Thank you all very much for coming. It's really great to be at USC to see how the other Annenberg lives, the other Annenberg works. And I also really want to thank Nina for coordinating all the details of this, and David for housing me for the past few days, and spreading the news about today. So I'm going to talk today, as Larry said, some about things that come from my dissertation, about the way that the prison fashions racial identities and generates radical opposition. And I'm going to speak about that particularly through the notion of visibility, the effort to be seen and understood, which I think is a crucial consideration of all social movements, but an especially both important and especially precarious one for people responding to conditions of confinement. I'm going to focus particularly on California in the 1970s, since that was the time and place in recent U.S. history where the connections between race and radicalism were most visibly attached to the prison. And I'm going to talk even more specifically about a figure named George Jackson, who I think represented or symbolized this matrix between race, radicalism, and confinement, and who also was sort of a native son, certainly not of USC, but of Los Angeles. And what I'm talking about today comes from my dissertation, but the bigger questions that it asks, the bigger questions that it engages, owe to more than the past 6 years of graduate school and the last 2 years of really focused research and writing. And come for more than the research that I've done separate from that on the creation, development, diffusion, and dissolution of American social movement. But my thinking on these issues owes a lot to more than a dozen years of voluntary engagement that I've had with the prison. As a high school junior and young activist, I was looking for guidance from social justice activists more experienced and more knowledgeable than myself. And I simply did not know where to find them in suburban South Florida. Ultimately, I found them in prison. Through reading various alternative newspapers, I came across groups that described themselves as supporting people they called political prisoners in the U.S. These were mostly veterans of the anti-racist, Black Power, and anti-imperialist social movements of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. And all of them were longtime activists who had been in prison longer than I had been alive. And so after coming across them, and much to my parents' chagrin, I began corresponding with several of them through letters and later through visits, phone calls, and even emails. They became my teachers and my friends, and I became a prison activist. They were my first or best teachers about war and racism and the ways each have been constitutive of American history and American policies. And these were women and men who provided some of the first insider accounts that I heard about civil rights movement and Black Power movement. The first time I learned about to think politically about Puerto Rico or other places that have colonial relationships with the United States. And they provided first-person narratives of the transition from protesting segregation to challenging mass incarceration. These relationships elucidated the ways in which the prison could be an archive and a valuable node connecting different generations of social justice movements. I did not initiate these correspondences out of any particular concern with the prison. I was rather interested in broader historical lessons and ideas about contemporary strategy. But over the years of such relationships, I began to think about the space and the significance of prison, and to think about it in relation to my overarching interests in the constitution of social movements and the space of racialization. Ostensibly overseen and regulated by the government, the prison is not a public institution. It is rather an expression of state power, one that has a vested, if fluctuating interest in invisibility. This invisibility is maintained by at least three factors, as I see it: geography, weaponry, and ideology. Geographically, prisons are not located in the urban areas from which most prisoners come. Rather, they are located in remote, desolate locations actually removed from most people. The architecture of the prison is comprised of walls and wires and staffed by people carrying guns, slugs, chemicals, and other tools of what Ruth Gilmore has called incapacitation. And finally, the prison is sustained through ideology, the public conception of who is in prison and why, and a deeper ideology about the need for imprisonment itself bolsters the policies of the carceral state. The visibility of this ideology, its salience in mass society, keeps the prison invisible as an institution by justifying incarceration as a necessity. Now, think about the prison in terms of its invisibility invites consideration of visibility as an oppositional strategy. Whereas on the terrain of visibility, prisoners have, at least temporarily, shortened geographical distance, repurposed weapons deployed against them, and countered some of the ideologies that maintain confinement. Visibility is a political strategy of contingency. I use it to refer both to public attention and mass consciousness. That is, both what people see and how they interpret what they see. Visibility describes both the general condition and the process, the means and mechanisms that different collectives utilize to gain attention and shape consciousness. Understood in this manner, I think visibility is a concern to a variety of groups, entities, and institutions. Yet it has special meaning for dispossessed and disenfranchised communities whose experience of inequality is mediated by the confluence of sight and consciousness. For these groups, I argue, visibility is a struggle for dignified control of representation as part of broader campaigns, a step as part of broader campaigns for self-determination. As with any representational schema, the achievement of visibility itself is partial and unfulfilling. It makes sense in relation to bigger goals, but falls short as a demand in its own right. Yet the process of seeking visibility is crucial in the development of both an individual self and a collective subjectivity. The visibility of the prison always conjures its invisibility. For those of us who do not regularly come into contact with the prison, we see it only as a rupture, a breach from its routine functioning that serves to remind us of its normative invisibility. The prison seeks to control its visibility, to control the ways in which it is seen. In describing the surveillance functions of panoptic prison, Michel Foucault wrote, quote, "Visibility is a trap." The transparency of sight, common to modern prison architecture, was in fact a mechanism of domination. And I do not dispute Foucault's assertion here, but I approach the question of visibility and its traps from a different angle. I am concerned primarily with visibility as a political strategy for those resisting the prison, especially from inside of it, but also the ways in which visibility enables connections between those inside and the rest of society. My take on the paradox of visibility owes as much to Foucault as it does to Ralph Ellison, whose character of the Invisible Man argues that, quote, "all life seen from the whole of invisibility is absurd." And part of my project, and particularly what I'm going to do here today, is to show how the absurdity of confinement is often negotiated but never settled through visibility. The pursuit of visibility rests on establishing a collective subjectivity while also exposing the conditions of invisibility as a result of absurd or immoral structures. Because the invisibility of the prison is so extreme, opponents of the prison, at least in the 1970s, utilized what might be considered exaggerated forms of visibility, spectacular forms of visibility. Simply put, prisoners needed to break through several layers of silencing to reach the public audience. Violence was the most dramatic way prisoners achieved such public intervention. Mass incarceration, as Dylan Rodriguez and Joy James have argued, is the outgrowth of domestic wars on crime, poverty, drugs, and dissent. But prisons also became war zones themselves in the early 1970s. There were, for instance, more than 100 riots at prisons throughout the country between 1968 and 1972, and an unknown number of violent altercations also occurred and increased in frequency and intensity in prisons during this time period, often the result of racialized conflict involving black prisoners and white guards or white prisoners. Prison radicals understood that such spectacles were necessary to place the question of confinement on the public agenda. Sympathetic activists outside of prison also hoped that spectacular demonstrations could expose the prison. They protested outside prison gates to draw attention to the space of the prison, or they bombed government offices to focus media attention on the ways prison officials crushed dissent inside through overwhelming displays of force. One of the most spectacular incidents of prison-related violence in this era was also one of the first. On August 7, 1970, 17-year-old Jonathan Jackson took over a Marin County courthouse, armed 3 prisoners who were in court that day, took as hostage a judge, a district attorney, and several jurors. San Quentin guards opened fire on the group before they left the parking lot of the courthouse, killing Jackson, 2 of the prisoners, and the judge. But despite the grim outcome, the rebels were clearly compelled by a concern for visibility. When a photojournalist happened upon the group on their way out of the courthouse, one of the men shouted, quote, "We are the revolutionaries. Take all the pictures you want," end quote. They understood that documentation of their actions was necessary for the intended messages to circulate. The raid challenged the prison's silence, as if to say that revolutionaries were willing to be exposed to the public at great harm, but that the prison remained obscure. They understood as well that visibility was a multimedia phenomenon. Rochelle McGee, the only participant to survive the assault, said afterward that the group had hoped to reach the radio station to broadcast news of guard violence against prisoners at San Quentin and to call for the freedom of Jonathan's older brother, George Jackson. In these and other incidents, prisoners recognized that dramatic, extreme measures could garner public attention to their concerns. But violence, the physical expression of visibility, was not the only or even the most significant dimension of prison radicalism and its pursuit of visibility. It was one powerful mode, but it joined other political and cultural expressions. To investigate them, I want to outline the conditions in which they emerged, specifically the spaces and structures of racial antagonism in the 1970s. The prison consolidates exploitation. It confines not the most criminal, but the most precarious. As a result, the prison is overwhelmingly black and poor. While black people did not become a majority of the prison population until the mid-1980s, they have long been disproportionately represented in the ranks of prisoners. By 1970, when Black Power and New Left groups began to cohere into something calling itself a prison movement, African Americans already made up 40% of California's prison population. As some of them began to challenge their incarceration, they sought visibility not only in response to the particular conditions they faced inside, but as a way to challenge the conditions that brought them there in the first place. By indicting the prison of white supremacy or the prison of the ghetto, dissident prisoners connected the spaces and structures of American inequality. Such metaphoric depictions of imprisonment melded with and bolstered the critiques of the prison as a material site. In this sense, the prison was an elastic concept, one that described both a specific site and the general condition of unfreedom. As a metaphor of unfreedom, the prison conjures images of chattel slavery, and indeed, prison activists argued that the prison represented the latest peculiar institution that created blackness through systems of confinement. This was no abstract metaphor. The high rates of black incarceration suggested, as Father Earl Neal of Oakland said in 1971, quote, The black condition is our imprisonment. But this condition was also a form of hope. Around this time, Eldridge Cleaver wrote that, quote, "Yesterday we were black and oppressed. Today our blackness is a tool for our liberation." Due to the rates of black imprisonment and its connotative attachment to slavery, an array of black analysts and activists turned to the prison as a useful concept to make sense of the particular cruelties and general utilities of race. Their strategic orientation to the prison fused its metaphoric and material concerns. The visibility of the prison protest seamlessly joined the metaphor and the material in offering a black liberationist critique of the prison. This metaphoric use of the prison grew within the civil rights and black power movements in the post-World War II era. As civil rights activists found themselves in jail as a result of their civil disobedience protests against Jim Crow laws in the South, they developed what Houston Baker called a black public sphere of incarceration. In Baker's analysis, jail was the fulcrum of visibility, breaking open the segregationist stranglehold on black life in the South in the 1950s and 1960s. Jail revealed the absurdity of the segregationist South. As activists sang and wrote in their jail cells, as they publicized their confinement for pursuing democratic rights, the use of civil disobedience to challenge the Jim Crow regime turned what has traditionally been among the most taboo locations, the jail cell, into a vehicle to make public black oppression, commitment, and subjectivity. There was a more working class element of this public sphere that could be found in the urban north and west that also passed through prison gates. Figures such as Nation of Islam leader Malcolm X, and later Black Panther Eldridge Cleaver, and ultimately George Jackson, became the identifiable symbols of this public sphere. These men had all been in prison and had articulated a definition of racism as a system of confinement, identifying a porous boundary between imprisonment and the prison. Malcolm X led the way in connecting this history of incarceration with the racism endemic to the United States. "If you're black, you were born in jail, in the North as well as the South," he told listeners on more than one occasion. The Black Panther Party, with Eldridge Cleaver as its most famous spokesman, continued this reasoning to expose the repressive dimensions of American life in general. Panther activists maintained that everyone in society was held either in maximum security, that is, actual prisoners in actual prisons, or in minimum security, the rest of society, or what they also called the first level prison. Around that time, Bob Dylan sang, quote, "Some of us are prisoners, the rest of us are guards." Figures like Johnny Cash and B.B. King recorded live albums in prisons or jails, and James Brown recorded an album with the cover of him behind bars. Cash told a reporter interviewing him about an album recorded live at Folsom Prison, quote, "I think prison songs are popular because most of us are living in one kind of prison or another. And whether we know it or not, the words of a song about someone who is actually in prison speak for a lot of us who might appear not to be, but really are," end quote. These same social movements also had an influence on prisoners. The forms of their dissent, riots, strikes, and cultural production, such as books, newspapers, and music, influenced the political consciousness and practice of prisoners. Nowhere was this more evident than in California. When rioters in Watts declared victory because, quote, "we made them," that is the government, "pay attention to us," prisoners in Folsom, Soledad, and San Quentin were listening. And not just because many of them were also from Watts, and looked with great interest on what occurred there. Indeed, as historians Donna Murch and Daniel Widener have recently shown, black migration to California, especially Los Angeles and Oakland, blossomed after World War II. The burgeoning prison movement reflected these dynamics as well. Many of the women and men who became some of the world's most famous prisoners in the 1970s, people such as Cleaver, Huey Newton, Angela Davis, and Rochelle McGee, were born in the South but lived in Watts and Oakland before being held in San Quentin and Soledad. Their arguments that prison extended chattel slavery developed from their experience in the Jim Crow South as much as their experience in the modern prison. The long shadow of the South is one of several ways that collective memory structured prison protest as a cultural modality of visibility. Prison radicals on both sides of the walls described prisoners as symbols embodied with deep racial meaning. This social movement battled on the train of collective memory, even as it dealt with people who are still alive. Physical separation and the lack of proximity removed prisoners to a certain level of abstraction and mnemonic representation. To make them visible, prisoners needed to be reduced to symbols that could be recalled through memory and media. This recall depended on making prisoners visible, on making visible narrative depictions of prisoners more than direct personal contact with prisoners, even as the concept of the prisoner itself needed to be symbolically represented by specific prisoners involved in specific current legal disputes. That is, narratives about prisoners, their political metal and meaning, created the public image more than did direct personal contact with them. The visibility of these narratives was attached to specific individuals who were said to represent prisoners in general. The Attica brothers, the Soledad brothers, Angela Davis, and Lolita Lebron. These and others were offered as evidence of who prisoners were, why they were in prison, and what social changes they sought. The texture of depictions changed with prisoners' access to media and their ability to play a role in shaping their own representation, making media a crucial site in the formation and recession of prison visibility. Narrative therefore played a central role in the development, circulation, and contestation of prison radicalism. That prison activism relied on narrative tools, however, does not suggest that this was purely or predominantly a literary movement. Rather, narrative was a tactic in the high-stakes physical and ideological battle between prisoners and the prison system, each one representing broader antagonisms of revolution versus reaction, of criminality versus order. Narratives were crafted through grassroots organizing and punctuated by the spectacular violence of both prisoners and the government. Ruth Gilmore has suggestively labeled prisons, quote, forgotten places, sites hidden through their invisibility as a result of their geographic location and the ideological denigration of those kept there. To oppose prisons requires first a recognition, a recollection, that they exist as part of the broader cultural and political economies. In the context of racial protests, seeing the prison becomes a part of making visible the border upholding racial divisions in society at large. The prison, too, is removed from the present by space more than by time. The prison, too, is recalled, that is, described and understood, made visible, through narrative and performative or commemorative acts. In this regard, visibility is the call for public witness as a form of seeking justice. Prison activism is an attempt to make present those for whom confinement has rendered absent. To remember prisoners is to circumvent the ways incarceration would have people be forgotten. As such, awareness of prisoners is deemed a necessary element of their freedom. The spatial remove of the prison relegates it to a certain mnemonic understanding. Print and visual culture make up for what is not experientially possible as a result of confinement. Memory practices can be spotted in open appeals to remember the incarcerated, as well as injunctives to see their bodies, read their words, or hear their voices. Such directives emerge with the media culture of social movements and dissident prisoners themselves. The 1970s witnessed almost a dozen regularly published newspapers or journals written by and for prisoners, with names such as Black Pride, Stateville Raps, Midnight Special, and Awakening of the Dragon. One of the longest running was Arm the Spirit, which formed at San Quentin in 1978 and edited by a prisoner named Khalima Aswad. It featured writings by prisoners from other facilities throughout the state and across the country, and was distributed by a group of supporters based in the Bay Area. The newspaper covered a variety of topics, from the late 1970s spike in Klan activity to anti-colonial struggles in South Africa, and much else. Other such publications included reviews of Black theater and literature. Together, they aimed to bring visibility to prisoner struggles in a period increasingly marked by law and order, and to connect prisoners to one another, not just as prisoners, but as theorists, as thinkers, as cultural creators, within the growing atomization of the prison itself. Right? This was the time period when prisons were instituting more control units and solitary confinement units to decrease prisoner contact even within the prison. So such media was a prisoner-initiated visibility that took place away from the panoptic power of the prison itself, an attempt by prisoners to put the prison under surveillance itself by making the prison visible. Such publications spoke in the vernacular of anti-colonial nationalism. Indeed, much as imprisonment reflected the priorities of the American nation-state, such oppositional nationalism was key to the expressions of Black as well as Puerto Rican prison radicalism. Nationalism was the political expression of much of prison protests, joining race and class in a critique of confinement. Nationalism provided a strong, if primarily discursive, counterweight to the overwhelming strength of the prison. As Benedict Anderson, Partha Chatterjee, and other theorists of nationalism have demonstrated, nationalism uses vernacular practices and media products to establish a collective we. For prison radicals, the collectivity embedded in asserting nationalist ethos identified a natural base of support. Whether that base understood itself that way is a different question. But because radical nationalism saw Black and other people of color as colonized populations, prisoners naturally emerged as the most representative spokespeople of the captive nation. No figure better expressed this combination of memory, nationalism, narrative, and violence than George Jackson. Arrested at age 18 and sentenced to serve between 1 year and life in prison after a $70 gas station robbery that he committed with a friend, Jackson became the symbol of and the inspiration for an array of prison protests that transpired in a decade. His reputation in the California prison system grew throughout the 1960s as a result of his physical strength and intellectual prowess. This combination first brought him to the attention of radicals when he joined the Black Panther Party in 1969, and was given the rank of field marshal, tasked with recruiting other prisoners to the party. In 1970, Jackson was charged along with 2 other men for the killing a prison guard in retaliation for a guard having killed 3 Black prisoner dissidents earlier that week. Recognizing his eloquence, Black Panther attorney Faye Spender, with the help of journalist Jessica Mitford, collected Jackson's letters to friends and family into a book. Soledad Brother, the prison letters of George Jackson, appeared in October 1970 and quickly became a bestseller. With the success of the book, Jackson conducted interviews with dozens of journalists, connecting through media with hundreds of thousands of people around the world, despite the fact that he was imprisoned in a solitary confinement unit and did not have access even to most other prisoners in San Quentin, first in Soledad and then the San Quentin. His ability to transcend the most isolating aspect of imprisonment inspired his supporters, including figures such as Jane Fonda and Jean Genet, James Baldwin and Angela Davis, Walter Rodney, and Michel Foucault, to believe that prison walls were not impenetrable. Indeed, Foucault's analysis of the colonizing power of the prison builds directly on what Jackson describes in Soledad Brother as the struggle between the colonizing visibility of surveillance and the liberating visibility of self-determination. Jackson defined the task of prison radicalism as an effort to reassert control over one's daily routine. He sought to make this struggle visible through media as a further way to undermine the prison's reach. Jackson described his attempt to transcend the horrors of the prison by making visible how he spent his time. He labeled the prison an endless void that he overcame by determining his schedule and filling his days with exercise and study. He gave visibility to sort of what can be considered a Black nationalist routine or ritual of self-reliance that other prisoners then adapted to their own purpose. Jackson described his daily routine in an interview for the New York Times, saying, quote, "I generally get 2 or 3 hours of sleep a day, 6 hours of exercise, and the rest of the day is spent reading and writing. I spend 45 minutes a day learning new words." In that interview and several other writings, Jackson boasted of doing 1,000 finger push-ups each day. This claim was celebrated by many of his supporters, who used it as evidence of his heroic strength. Instead of doing time, Jackson illustrated that prisoners were using time to refashion the prison as a space for the cultivation of a revolutionary praxis that was both conceptual and physical. Jackson saw part of his task as making visible the ideological labor of political education. He described his own shift in consciousness upon entering prison, how more politically sophisticated prisoners introduced him to communist theorists, and how he likewise tutored other Black prisoners in a range of revolutionary thought and martial arts. Jackson highlighted this prison pedagogy for the purpose of making visible the transformative potential of prisoners in general. These 2 dimensions of George Jackson, his eloquence and his alleged violence, continue to structure his visibility from the publication of Soledad Brother to the ways people tried to make sense of his death on August 21st, 1971, in a gruesome event in which 3 guards and 2 other prisoners were also killed, and just 10 months after Soledad Brother first appeared. Authorities described it as an escape attempt, while others saw it as evidence of the government conspiracy against Jackson that had already been well documented. However, the fact that Jackson died with a gun in his hand after prisoners had quickly taken control of the solitary confinement unit in which he was held cast aspersions within the media on the image of Jackson as an innocent victim, even as many details within the government's claims of what happened were also brought to challenge within journalistic discourse. While he himself never offered nor desired such an image, some of Jackson's supporters have diligently described him as this innocent victim, which is what created the backlash following his death. The realities of imprisonment meant that Jackson was not the most significant shaper of his own image. Even his book of letters went through an editing and vetting process over which he had little input. Because he had limited control over his visibility even while he was alive, Jackson was interpreted through the zero-sum prism of authenticity. While authenticity has often been a metric by which people measure figures, especially black, that they encounter on the landscape of representation, when prisons removed from society increases the saliency of authenticity. The prison curtails public access to its captives, leaving media as the primary way most people encounter the prison, if at all. The underlying ideologies of punishment hold simply that only bad people are confined. As a result, for a prisoner to be newsworthy in a non-negative way, as a cultural producer, for instance, invites a challenge to the embedded construction of this social value. While Jackson put forth a rather nuanced view of guilt, blackness, and self-worth, constructions of him by the media, by many of his supporters, and by his opponents were rarely as thoughtful. Journalists, for instance, praised Soledad Brother for its authenticity, saying that the experience of confinement had given Jackson unique insight into the human condition. The New York Times celebrated Soledad Brother as, quote, the best volume by a black since the autobiography of Malcolm X. The Washington Monthly said that the book, quote, breathes you in by celebrating your shared humanity. British journalists described Jackson as, quote, a free black man in white America, attempting to obliterate ghettos of the mind, and, quote, a man who lost his freedom and found himself. Bantam Books used similar sentiments to package the book as universal and Jackson as authentic. The paperback edition of the book carried a quote from Huey Newton proclaiming Jackson to be, quote, the greatest writer of us all. The undefined subject of Newton's praise could be read as both a black us and a universal us. The publisher also treated Jackson's family, the original audience for most of the letters in the book, as a synecdoche for a national or global potential audience. The paperback edition proclaimed that because of his burning need to communicate with his family, Jackson finally communicates with everyone. Such depictions of Jackson as an authentic and universal voice of black protests did more than just counteract his own efforts to be seen as part of a broader collective struggle. They also implied that his eloquence certified his victimhood. Because he was such a good writer, someone who could speak to and for us all, he was an upstanding citizen, as other good writers often say. So the circumstances of his death, however, challenged this presentation. Instead, the conservative voices clamoring for law and order, those who had long castigated black prisoners and their supporters as dangerous elements to be forever removed from society, gained an even wider and more supportive hearing. These figures also blended the material prison with its metaphoric connotations. In an editorial titled, "We Will All Become Prisoners," California Governor Ronald Reagan said that Jackson's death demonstrated the need for harsher sanctions, lest the real upstanding citizens be held captive by, quote, violence, terror, and contempt for the moral values of our society. Conservative journalist William Buckley said Jackson's run-ins with the law prior to his incarceration, the reason why he received such an open-ended sentence, demonstrated that he was incurably violent. These and other narratives begin to solidify a broader trope around Jackson, and with him all prisoners, that held that they were the constructions of a carefully guarded left-wing invention. In a lengthy 1972 Esquire article, about the relationship between Angela Davis and George Jackson, journalist Ron Rosenbaum argued that Jackson's supporters wished to obscure from view any troublesome aspects of Jackson's personality, namely his emphasis on guerrilla war and his flirtatious relationship with female supporters. This trope was initiated by journalists and consolidated with the publication of several memoirs and books published later in the decade, and written mostly by one-time supporters of Jackson. These included Gregory Armstrong, the editor of Soledad Brother, as well as James Carr, a former prisoner who had been incarcerated with Jackson, and British New Left journalist Joe Smith. This trend culminated in the 1981 true crime book about Jackson by novelist Clark Howard. These texts project onto Jackson their own racial anxieties. Armstrong describes Jackson as physically superhuman, but emotionally childish, never as a fully grown adult. Howard reveals that he was motivated to write about Jackson after discovering that the two men were from the same part of Chicago. Howard, who is white, rejected Jackson's use of the term ghetto as too black a designation for the neighborhood that they shared. A concern with authenticity similarly compels these posthumous constructions of Jackson. Armstrong, one of the architects of describing Jackson as an innocent victim in 1970 and 1971, described him in 1974 as a guilty man that Armstrong had befriended only for his own psychological needs. Quote, "I know why so many middle-class whites like myself identify as blacks," he wrote. "We say to ourselves that only blacks possess true authenticity. I know that loving George, caring about him, is part of my desire to be real," end quote. But that reality was only possible because Jackson was incarcerated and therefore could not intervene in people's constructions of him. Gerbner Smith similarly recalled being attracted to Jackson after working on one of Johnny Cash's prison albums, because he thought Jackson was a more authentic figure than Cash. These posthumous constructions of Jackson presume to expose the real Jackson, based on personal relationships or on new research. Yet what they reveal instead is largely that which Jackson had always boasted: the violence, the celebration of armed struggle, the sexual longing, all were a part of Jackson's visibility that some had dismissed as hyperbole, that others had ignored, but which many took at face value. Jackson never tried to hide these aspects of his personality or his politics. They were, in fact, the substance of the visibility he sought. These were the precise things that he was trying to make visible. When he died in an event that proved the sincerity of his militant self-representation, critics objected to him as dangerously inauthentic. Rebecca Hill argues that George Jackson tested, quote, "the left's ability to trust black men, to believe in imperfect heroes, and to define itself without the long-standing and comfortable logic of white rebellion and black victimization," end quote. Unable to reconcile George Jackson, the eloquent writer, with George Jackson, who died a violent death in a bloody event that he in some way participated in, critics resorted to describing him and the movement he represented as the inauthentic figment of cross-cutting narratives. Such arguments emerged independently from, yet contributed to, the grassroots movement among conservatives pressing for greater law and order in this time period, those who wanted longer sentences and more in that, these texts can be seen as complementary to an array of cultural products and political developments of the late 1970s that portray white society as being under attack by black criminality. These posthumous stories of George Jackson reveal a profound inability to trust the sincerity of black oppositional political figures, especially ones operating from the constraints of confinement. The shifting parameters of his visibility define Jackson first as an innocent man and later as a manipulative criminal. Both representations or representations of Jackson require the certifications of journalists, activists, or politicians to demonstrate his authenticity. Their investment in Jackson as authentic owed to widely shared views that prisoners, blacks, and black prisoners could not be political actors on their own behalf. Instead, they could only be foils for the development of broader agendas, whether political or psychological. The black condition, as applied to Jackson in particular, and black prisoners in general, became the visible sight of white relations. As a visible public figure, George Jackson has always been the subject of narratives competing for dominance. Yet Jackson himself was more consistent than the authentic meanings given him through various constructions. George Jackson in these narratives was inauthentic less because of his deception, than his consistency, his sincerity. That is, he seemed to believe the violent revolution that he preached. Visibility is a necessary element in the making of collective subjectivity from below. Domination needs to be exposed in order to be contested. However, the gap between revelation and transformation is wider than we might expect, especially in situations where figures are isolated by both geography and ideology. The potential for visibility to offer counterclaims of racialization is mitigated by the ways collective consciousness is already gendered and racialized. The paradox of visibility, then, is that life seen from its purchase can be just as absurd as that seen from what Ellison called the whole of invisibility. The politics pursued on a landscape of representation generates questions of truth. Visibility engages notions of subjectivity in a search for, quote, the real, for the man behind the curtain, the motivation behind the deeds, or the deeds that contradict the words. As with any social movement strategy, the pursuit of visibility is a battle over knowledge, how it is used and parceled, by whom, and for what ends. Visibility is a material force that, no matter how contingent, cannot be avoided. It is enmeshed with diverse practices of racialization and politicization. It illuminates the high-stakes battles over punishment and justice, policy and meaning, that continue to delineate complex issues of power and social change in society. Thank you.
Questions, comments?
It's a great presentation, very informative. Let me preface this. One of the problems I have with kind of contemporary representations of the prison industrial complex and it as a base of kind of structural inequality and racial politics is this kind of representation of black prisoners, or as prisoners as kind of black men, and kind of no analysis of like the increasing rates of black and brown women who are being incarcerated. And I'm wondering, do you see manifestations of this in terms of kind of the representation of the prison and prisoners as this kind of revolutionary radical force in the 1970s, this kind of gendered representation?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think if you look, certainly at George Jackson as the theorist, not quite the architect, but the theorist of what prison protests looked like. Here's someone who elevated the all-male surroundings in which he became politicized as the natural basis of political action. And so I think there's a heavily sort of gendered component in how people thought of prison protests. At the same time, the actual work of particularly prison activists who are not in prison has another interesting sort of gender dynamic that particularly Rebecca Hill is pointing to as feminine aspects of labor and of care, right? And around supporting people who are in prison, encouraging people to write, to visit, these sort of affective dimensions are themselves heavily gendered as well. There's also a way in which some of the masculine, sort of presumed masculinity of the prisoner obscures the ways in which women prisoners were also engaged in their own battles that may not have looked the same way as what was happening in the prison.
Right. I mean, one of the things I found, and just thinking of some of the texts you mentioned, Soul on Ice, Autobiography of Malcolm X, Blood in My Eye, how they operate as somewhat, this kind of masculinist discourse about the prison, right? And how, in many ways, this kind of pursuit of visibility is also kind of pursuit of manhood, right? And how it's articulated in various chapters. I mean, Blood in My Eye, he's writing letters to his little brother, right? And he's telling him how to become a man.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, and that's what makes figures like Angela Davis or Lolita Lebron so significant, is that these are the women who sort of break through that to become symbols of prison radicalism on par with figures like Jackson or Cooper, although it's still within the same masculinist framework of sort of who counts, right? And the political actions that they engage in is what made them count.
I mean, I think it's also intriguing why because people like Assata Shakur or Mae Mallory don't get mentioned, right? How does Angela Davis, by having this relationship to like Marcuse, how does that give her, how is she privileged in ways that other women might not have been?
Right. And all the women who were in prison for, fighting back against men who were raping them or assaulting them. Which in some ways this is a problem in what happened at the time, but in other ways this is a problem of the historian. Because doing the archival work, I saw a lot about Assad Shakur, about Joanne Little, and other women who were in prison for fighting back against sexual assault. And yet in contemporary scholarship, that has yet to receive the same amount of attention.
Actually, to follow up on that, I think it's also the labor, not just of the historian, but of the media and the way in which the media tells this, constructs this narrative that you're talking about. So I was thinking when you were talking about visibility, you make this really important argument about the complicated and complex nature of visibility, and you also say that the pursuit of visibility in this particular context rests on a kind of pursuit of collective subjectivity, right? Which the story, and then the story of Jackson bears these two things out. But the role of the U.S. media in the, and it was just as true in the 1970s as it is now, is never about collective subjectivity, right? And so if the media is our memory recall here, if the media is our conduit to visibility for the prison, so that it doesn't become what Ruthie calls a forgotten place, right? So that, I think that, I just wonder if you could comment on the way in which the media is about selective remembering always, and not about simply a memory recall, because we all know the names, and this is, I think, part of Taj's point too. We all know the names of the people that that you referenced here, right? Because they are highlighted as particular kind of prison celebrities by the media, and often are men, and often, and so the forgotten, the invisibility. So anyway, I was just wondering if you could comment on the role of the media in its individualist focus, and how that challenges that pursuit of visibility is about collective subjectivity.
Yeah, I think it's interesting both in the sort of dominant media and within left-wing media how some of those things play out, because it's not necessarily the case that left-wing media was better.
Right.
But I think it's both about the various journalistic norms and conventions that emphasize the sort of singular and de-emphasize the collective. But it's also about the overwhelming power of prison, and of how foreign that is to so many people. Unfortunately, less so now than in the 70s. Right, but the sort of foreignness of the prison, the great remove of the prison, means that I think people, that journalists, both within dominant media and left-wing media, thought that personal stories would be the way that people could connect, and that people would invest their energy and their sort of affect in the prison, or their empathy in the sort of plight and struggle of prisoners, if they could identify with them. And the way that they could identify with them is by knowing them as people, with the sort of understanding, with the wink, that those individuals are part of the collective mass. And I think that's always a risky proposition. But I think there were some people who tried to engage it more usefully, and usually it was the prisoners themselves. It was the people who were part of this collectivity and could position their own trials and tribulations alongside the collective in which they lived, rather than the journalists of the left or the center, or the mainstream who were able to do that. Okay, so George Jackson is always making reference to the prisoners who mentored him. When Soledad Brother is such a big success, he gets quite a bit of money for the second book, Blood in My Eye. Much of that money, he makes a will shortly before he dies. He donates almost all of that money to other prisoners and their defense campaigns. Right? So people on the inside recognize themselves much more as a collective than once they've matched the journalistic convention.
Dan, you're talking about a period in which, as you said, there was a lot of urban upheaval as well as in the prison. And you also indicated, as you know anyway, that the prisons have exploded since then. after the 80s. I don't know what the figures are, but, you know, by some notable factor. But we don't seem to have anywhere near the same degree. I mean, other than maybe when we have, you know, there's a figure who is, you know, who is other, of either media visibility or the kinds of prison-based protests that were at that point so common. I mean, do you have any thoughts on why that happened? I mean, one part could be that was merely what was going on in society also going on in prison. But the prisons haven't gotten any better since then. Arguably, they would have only gotten worse for no other reason because they're overcrowded.
Right.
So why are we not seeing some parallel today?
Yeah. Well, I think there are many ways to answer that question and approach that question. I think one thing is, you know, certainly to recognize the work that people are doing, even if it hasn't crossed that threshold. And I think some of the, you know, organizations, groups like Doctoral Resistance who work with prisoners on the inside, as well as groups like the Moratorium Project that try to stop the expansion of prisons, you know, I think are this trying to both build on but also learn from what mistakes were in that period. And I think that there's still a missing sense of strategy, right? There was a sense within the 70s, you know, building on armed struggle, on the sort of urban revolt as a strategy. And I think that's clearly not what's going to happen where people are at. I think the strength of the law and order campaigns really began in the 60s, even if it wasn't until the 80s that they yielded the massive prison construction. It was really a massive, you know, counter-revolution. And I think, you know, it's one that was far better resourced and financed and structured than anything on the left.
Just like in other aspects of society.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the only thing I'll say is, you know, part of the change in prisons in the past 30 years has been both the greater isolation within inside, around limiting the contact that people have with one another, and so limiting people's abilities to form productivity, not erasing it entirely, but curtailing it significantly. And the other thing that's happened, at least in the past 15 years, in some facilities, is the introduction of television. Part of what enabled the prison protest to be as massive as it was in the 70s was that prisoners were reading so much. And maybe they started off reading, you know, trashy romance novels, but then someone would pass them, you know, the autobiography of Malcolm X or Soledad Brother, and you know, the Communist Manifesto, and people would start engaging in political dialogue. And I think it's not just, you know, the introduction of television has resulted in less reading, but also it's not like you have, you know, books like the autobiography of Malcolm X being published by mainstream presses, right? It's both also a narrowing of the discourse within the publishing industry, and that has as much of an effect in prisons as it does in society.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next week, Dan is available to meet with graduate students at 1:15, 223A. Next week we have NCA, so no talk, and on the 22nd, Lance Holbert from Ohio State University.